All right, we're back. I think this is episode 15, talking about how to make change less challenging. So, if this is your first time tuning in, welcome. And if you're a longtime listener, awesome to have you here. It can be discouraging when you know what you want to do, but you can't get yourself to do it consistently. It can seem like, let's say, despite your desire to change, almost like there's these invisible forces that hold you back, And really what I want to touch on today and leave you to take away from this episode is just a confidence knowing that you can change. But more than that, you can take these obstacles to change and you can make them into stepping stones. So that's really what I want you to take away from today's episode. Now, of course, before I dive into it, I want to just touch on a couple of free things that I offer to help people move forward. So number one is if you want to jump on a quick 15-minute chat with me, freedomnutrition.rocks.rocks/let's chat. You can go there, book a free 15-minute chat with me any point in time. We'll talk about anything that's got you feeling stuck and help you to get unstuck. That'd be awesome. I'm more than happy to do that. I've got a book called Crush Your Cravings. You want a copy of Crush Your Cravings? Sweet. Go to freedomnutrition.rocks/book to get a copy of that. And I do have 3 free 7-day challenges. You can see what they are at freedomnutrition.rocks/7-day challenge. All right, cool. So today we're talking about how to make change less challenging. And I want to share with you a story first, actually, because I think stories are a great way to try to illustrate a point, especially if they have a little bit of humor. Now, I learned this about, there was a tribe in some jungle. I can't even tell you which jungle it was. But anyways, to catch a monkey, what they would do is they would somehow, They get a coconut shell and they would lock it in place and they would just cut a little opening in the top and they would put something shiny in that coconut shell. Now, the monkey could reach in there with its hands before it was holding onto something and it could grab that shiny thing, but then it couldn't get its hand out and it was stuck. So the monkey would grab the shiny object and as its hand was stuck, it couldn't get away. Now, all that's really required for that monkey to break free would be to let go of the shiny object, but the monkey wouldn't let it go. And so it's so interesting that, sometimes we might just be holding on to something really, really small, but because change can be a little bit like this. We're clinging to something that we maybe don't want to let go of. And part of change and what makes it challenging is that it does involve letting go of some things, and that can be a little bit uncomfortable. And so there's this idea called 2 crazy questions. It's not originally my idea. I think it comes from Precision Nutrition originally, but I wanted to share them here because I think they're pretty fitting. And when you're feeling stuck and as though I kind of want change, but I don't. Maybe you're a little bit ambivalent, we could say. The first question to ask yourself is, what is good about not changing? In other words, if I don't change anything, if I stay on the path I'm on, because we often think about this like, I have to change and it's going to be so great, it's going to be so fantastic, and so on. Now, look, if your life was 100% miserable and you absolutely could not stand it any further, then maybe it wouldn't be such a big deal. But what we want to do is we actually want to acknowledge, what are the good things about not changing? How is your life easier in a sense by not changing? And identify them and don't treat them like they're bad things. There are good things about where you're presently at, and there's reasons why you might not want to change. So asking this question can help you. And the other one is, what's bad about changing? In other words, what do you have to give up if you're creating change? Because again, if change was 100% good and staying the same was 100% bad, we'd probably have no problem creating change. But ultimately, there are some reasons why we don't want to change. And there's some reasons that are good about not changing. And there's some things about changing that are maybe not so good. And so now there's a couple of other ways that we might find ourselves stuck and struggling to change. And I want to highlight what I think are kind of 4 of the biggest obstacles that stand in the way of us creating change. Because if we can shrink those obstacles, change becomes a whole lot easier. And so speaking of shrinking the obstacles, really that gets to point number 1, or obstacle number 1, which is overwhelm. So overwhelm, and the antidote in a nutshell is shrink the change. But what do we mean by overwhelm? Well, overwhelm is something that feels very, very big in our head. And when something occupies a lot of metaphysical space in our head, the idea of change and introducing something new is really, really hard, right? There's no space for change. And one of the questions that my clients ask, or I ask my clients, I should say, is how do you eat an elephant? This is that I want to call it the famous question I always ask my clients, because very often what has us feeling stuck is this feeling of being overwhelmed. I already have too much on my plate right now. I can't possibly take anything else on in this moment. Now, the way that we very often look at change, though, and what stops us from getting started is we're trying to wrap our head around the entire problem. And that's why we ask this question, well, how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is one bite at a time. when we're feeling overwhelmed in this metaphor, it's kind of like trying to swallow the elephant whole. It's impossible. So when we look at the task and the scope and the size, this metaphorical elephant, it looks huge. It can feel really daunting and overwhelming because it's true. We can't tackle the entire thing all at once. But the great thing is we don't have to. It stops, us from taking the first step because we're trying to figure out the 10th step or the 100th step. And that's what we want to break free from here, because I want to encourage you and say, like, you don't have to even know what the 10th step is, let alone what the 100th step is. All you really have to know is, what is my next step? What is my first step? And that's exactly where you want to start, is step one. What is one step I need to take that moves me away from the place I'm currently in? And that means I've started creating change. Otherwise, it's too overwhelming, because, our brain wants to keep us safe. That's one of the most powerful drives inside our brain, is keeping us safe and keeping us in somewhere that is familiar and comfortable. If we try to move too far away from where we're presently at, our brain actually puts up more resistance. So obstacle number 2 is self-talk, and I call this one disarm the alarm. So our self-talk will convince us not to change. And it goes back to this, our brain wants to keep us safe. So our self-talk, often what it will do is it will take our worries and it blows them up. It expands them. It makes them as big as possible. And again, when something occupies a lot of space in our mind, especially something like worries, it convinces us, of all the bad things that might happen. And that stops us from taking forward steps to change. And worries really create like what seem like giant obstacles to change. But what's interesting is we kind of already addressed this if we asked those 2 crazy questions that I referred to. What's good about not changing and what's bad about changing? So we can already start to disarm that part of it. Because again, our brain wants to keep us safe by keeping us stuck in familiarity. So how do we disarm the alarm, as I'm talking about? Well, one of the simplest ways of doing this, one of my favorite ways of doing this, is simply to take the worries in my mind and put them on paper. And so what you could do is you could get a piece of paper and you write down all the reasons that your brain tells you why this change isn't going to work. Write them all down, all of them. Don't judge them. You just get them down on paper, because here's the thing. Once they're on paper, we've kind of trapped them. So here's how I think about it. In my head, when worries are rattling around in there, they can grow and they can morph and they can shift and they can do all kinds of things. My imagination can run wild with them. But once they're on paper, they can't move, and I've trapped them and they can't keep running around in my mind. And so now it allows me to look at them and go, like, how realistic is this? And maybe even what I could do is I could write them down on a piece of paper and come back a week later and say, did any of those worries come true? So really, again, disarming. It's almost like I like the idea, that picture of trapping our worries on paper. So the third obstacle I think that we come into is the time crunch. I'm too busy. I already have so much going on. Now is not the right time. Oh man, the number of times that I hear this one. I really want to do this, but now is not the right time. And I've got news for you. There never is a right time for change. Like, there's never going to be a right time. It's always going to be inconvenient. It's always going to involve us giving up something in order to change, because we're masters at filling time. That's what we do. So we live in the age of social media. We live in the age of streaming media and TV shows and movies and things like that. And so, of course, we don't have time, because we're so adept at filling time. And a lot of the things that we fill time with, we don't even really register in our conscious brain. And so really, if we're feeling this time crunch, what we need to do is create awareness around how our time is spent. So it's like, well, what does a typical weekday look like? Consider tracking your time just for one day, one 24-hour stretch. Well, the sleeping part's pretty easy to track, but you see, we can't change what we're not aware of. And really, here's a question, a really, I think, important question to ask yourself. How much time do you feel like you need to spend on your health each day? And really, how much time do you think is worth like spending on your health versus doing things that are hurting your health? Like, what is it worth for you to put a little bit of time into this? And then, without judgment, ask this question. Well, how much time is being spent on procrastination, whether it's, streaming TV shows, social media, that kind of thing. So getting clear on how we spend our time, because in our mind, because we're so good at filling time in this modern, digital media age, I mean, these things are engineered to suck our time away. They're literally engineered to hijack our brains and to suck time away and to suck us out of conscious awareness and get us not realize. Have you ever started to like scroll, I don't know, Instagram Reels or something like that, or TikTok, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, how did an hour and a half just disappear? Right? they're engineered to be like this. Or you're watching some show on a streaming TV platform, and all of a sudden you're 8 episodes in. And I think I saw a meme the other day, and it was like, watch a 10-hour movie? Are you nuts? Of course not. But watch 10 episodes? Oh, yeah, of course, I'm in. And it's like the same thing in a sense. So again, there's this way of drawing us into like a story, and just we forget and lose track of time. Well, the antidote to that is really to start becoming aware of how we spend our time. There really isn't kind of another way around that. So the last one I just want to touch on here is what I call the mindset muddle. And really the antidote here is to get clarity. So what do I mean by mindset muddle? Well, I think probably it's helpful first to define, well, what do I mean by mindset? And we could just say, like, it's the attitude you have about your life in general. Maybe that's a good starting point for mindset. I'm sure we could come up with more definitions, but we can start with that. The attitude we have about our life in general. For example, do you wake up looking forward to the day? Or do you wake up with a sense of dread and heaviness? So maybe get curious about where you're presently at. And, one of the terms that I use a lot, if you listen to anything I put out or watch anything I put out, you're going to hear this term compassionate awareness. It's so important. Why? Because awareness with judgment makes us hide our behaviors. When we start to become aware of things that we're doing that are not helpful and we judge ourselves, or we feel we're being judged by others, we want to hide those behaviors, not change them. So compassion lets us look at those behaviors without judgment, and then we can create change. Now, going back to this mindset piece though, it's really easy to obtain like a negative mindset when we live in a world that's filled with a lot of distressing things. Like, let's be real, with 24/7 news, we can be told about every major tragedy that's happening in the world today, all around the world. That feels like a monumental burden to be stuck up against. Like, wow, it's more than like any one person can handle. And you can imagine if this is what you feed your brain every day without even really realizing it, that like whether social media or news media, it's engineered to dump a whole bunch of negativity because negativity attracts our eyeballs, it attracts our attention. So are we feeding on constant negativity? Well, if that's what we feed on, it's going to be nearly impossible to develop any kind of positive mindset. And then we throw into it just the challenges of everyday life. Like life itself is challenging, right? There's a lot of stuff that gets thrown our way. And so what's really interesting though is that research shows that our attitude, in other words, how we frame, how we describe in our mind the challenges that we face, can have a huge impact on our ability to deal with them. And so the mindset or the frame or perspective that we take towards the challenges of life we face affect how open we are to change. So in other words, if we are stuck in a negative mindset, it triggers us feeling, whenever our brain feels unsafe, incredible amounts of resistance to change. Now, on the opposite side of that is when we can start to reframe and start to see some of the positive things in our life and change our mindset, as cliche as that might sound, our brain actually starts to get a little bit more open to change. So think about this idea of this mindset muddle. How do we get clarity from it? So we've talked about maybe the problem around that. Now, how do we get clear? And I think there's a really simple thing that we can do. There's actually 3 things, but I want to key in on one thing here. And that is make time for quiet time that doesn't involve screens. I think that's a key feature. So it's like set aside, we just talked about the time crunch, but put aside a little bit of time every day to spend a few minutes alone to really clear your head, to stop filling head with like sound and news and noise and media and shows. Like stop filling our conscious awareness with that and give our brain a little bit of a break. So it might look like, for example, some people get up early before other people in the house do if you live with other people. Other times it might be quiet time before bed when everybody else has gone to bed. Or if you're really pushed for time, you could take a short break, a 30-second or even a 60-second break, just somewhere away from screens where you can go and kind of be quiet. Like just spending a couple of minutes alone, maybe a couple of times a day, can make a real, genuinely a world of difference in how you feel. Especially if you find yourself starting to feel really frustrated, overwhelmed, upset, or angry, because look, we can find literally thousands upon thousands of reasons to be angry, frustrated, despondent, filled with despair, because we can find out about all the horrible things happening in the world today. But there's a lot of good stuff happening in the world today too, despite everything else that's going on. So really, what we feed our brain really shapes our mindset. And so If you're going to have a little bit of quiet time, like I said, it's super, super important. This time is screen free. You might want to have some quiet music, some white noise, but really give your brain a rest, and then because change feels less daunting when we feel a degree of hopefulness and clarity around it. And really the last couple things I wanted to touch on here, really again connected to this mindset piece, because mindset is a cliched term that gets thrown around a lot, I really think, in maybe self-help, self-development, personal development kind of circles, and for a good reason. But really, gratitude. And gratitude has, in the last few years become like a really popular practice, and maybe even sometimes feels like a cliched practice, but I really like to think about it from a neuroscience perspective. What are we doing when we practice gratitude? Well, we take our brain that is wired to look for negative things in life, and we have a world that wants to dump negative things in our face all day, every day. So when we practice gratitude, what we're doing is we're teaching our brain to look for positive things in our life, the tiniest little things. Teach our brain to look for those, because our brain is wired, the default setting is look for negativity, look for threats, look for scary things. So we need to consciously practice this. And the simpler we can make it, it can be like, hey, I'm grateful for the roof over my head. I'm grateful for the clothes I get to wear. I'm grateful for I turn on the tap and water comes out. That's a great way to start changing our mindset. And there's one other thing that we can do, and that is that we can practice kindness. And kindness doesn't have to be a really big thing either. But here's what I think is really amazing about kindness. You do something for at least two people and potentially create a ripple effect. Because again, we go back to there's a lot of terrible things, a lot of scary things, there's a lot of troubling things happening in the world today. And as one person out of 8 billion, it can feel like, what on earth can I do when there's such enormous problems facing the world today? Like it just feels like a hopeless situation. Well, the cool thing is you don't have to solve all of that. That's not on your shoulders. But what you can do is you can do something kind. And I know this might never happen, but I just want to picture this for a sec. Imagine if like half of the world's population just made a decision. Today, I'm going to do something kind for somebody. Wow, this wave would sweep the world. And it sounds, again, really, I don't know, it sounds ridiculously all over the top optimistic maybe. But I just share that because sometimes we brush aside the impact of something small like that. But if you made it your point just to try to do one kind thing every day for somebody in some way, send them a text message. Hey, I was just thinking about you. Give them a shout. Pay for someone's coffee in the drive-thru, whatever. If you make it your point to try to do something kind for somebody every day, your mindset will improve. And as your mindset improves, your mind is more open to creating change. And so really, I just kind of want to wrap up with that. I really appreciate you tuning in. I really hope that you're inspired and encouraged, because I wanted to give you some takeaways, some practical takeaways, knowing like how you can shrink the obstacles to change. So it really feels like you can have a clear path forward that you can move with confidence. And so thanks so much for tuning in again. It's always been a pleasure. And maybe lastly, again, I'll just throw it up here one more time. Hey, if I've shared something with you that you found helpful, but you'd like to figure out, well, how can I make this work for me personally just a little bit better? Hey, go to freedomnutrition.rocks/let's chat. Hop on a 15-minute chat with me. I'd be happy to bounce some ideas around with you, help you get some clarity around this kind of stuff. And of course, I've got my 3 free 7-day challenges. I put these out there because maybe not everybody's in a position to work with me or hire me as their coach. That's okay. I've got some free resources that can help you get started anyways. You can go to freedomnutrition.rocks/7-day challenge and get started on your own journey to change. So again, thank you so much for tuning in. It's been a pleasure.